Good morning, everyone, and thank you again for joining us. Today we will be addressing fraud, waste, and abuse related to expense reimbursements and purchase card use as an illustration to demonstrate the capabilities of the IBM i2 Fraud Intelligence Analysis platform. Organizations are seeing an increase in schemes involving fraudulent disbursements of cash. Schemes such as skimming and cash larcenies have been relatively common for decades. However, asset misappropriation, particularly involving employee expense reimbursements and purchase card abuse, has become a concern to companies in the private sector. Given the current environment of government-wide fiscal austerity, it's also a concern to public agencies, as they could be costing organizations in a very big way. This can involve anything from submitting duplicate expenses, receiving reimbursement for non-existent expenses, or making an excessive number of purchases from the same vendor to stay under spending limits. Today we will utilize powerful tools and demonstrate how fraud intelligence analysis can help you uncover and identify these types of schemes very quickly and effectively, ultimately documenting the results for supporting process improvement of internal controls or for potential litigation or prosecution. Utilizing these tools allows investigators and analysts to increase their productivity and to greatly reduce the amount of time required to deliver high-value intelligence with data sets that are growing by the minute. Our scenario begins when Senior Fraud Analyst David Rowe begins to follow up on some red flags that have hit his radar. His department recently received some tips that there are potentially some loopholes in the travel and expense reimbursement system, and some employees are reportedly taking advantage of those. David decides to begin his analysis by reaching into a powerful repository where collaboration between he and his coworkers occurs. As part of his sample set, he identified a few employees who are in the accounts payable system and have received expense reimbursements in the recent past. He begins by conducting a simple search of one person of interest, Joe Brown. The fuzzy search logic allows him to receive results that take into account things like typos and common name variations. For instance, putting in the name Joe gave results which include Joseph and Joel. He selects the proper one and adds them to the chart to explore any connections that exist. David checks to see what type of activity Mr. Brown has had by looking for active purchasing cards or expense reports. He sees several expense reports that were submitted manually. He also notices that Mr. Brown does have an active purchasing card issued to him. Now, although this information came into the repository from different siloed data sources, it all becomes immediately searchable by any authorized person. Now, the analyst chooses to continue to pull that investigative thread and brings in the individual expenses claimed by Mr. Brown on each of the expense reports. A large amount of information is visualized on the chart, so David uses one of the many built-in analysis tools to help him get a good idea of the information that he has to work with, as well as see any patterns and trends that might exist. Utilizing filters and histograms, he's able to look at any patterns and trends, in this case in the dates that the expenses were incurred. He observes a seemingly reasonable amount of expense variation from month to month, with the exception of July 2006, when Mr. Brown took a leave of absence. Applying an additional layer of analysis, called a heat matrix, he's able to view a valuable cross-section of information in just a matter of seconds. For example, choosing to look at the expense types against the dates, David sees an unusually high or disproportionate number of expenses related to mileage. To get a solid total, he approaches the data from a slightly different angle, using a filter instead of a histogram. He sees 655 expenses related to mileage in just a 3-year period, which undoubtedly appears excessive. Utilizing fraud intelligence analysis, in just a matter of a few moments, our analyst has identified an area of wasteful spending. Now, if it's determined that the mileage is reasonable based on Mr. Brown's job role, then the money being reimbursed to Mr. Brown due to daily mileage on his personal car could be greatly reduced by providing him with a fleet vehicle or a company lease. Based on the findings of waste within the manually submitted expense reports, David decides that he should look into Mr. Brown's purchasing card. This time, he approaches his analysis in a different way by conducting a targeted search. He steps back into the repository and looks specifically for purchase card spending. So in this case, he is specifically looking for purchase card accounts. And the Smart Match allows him to, again, utilize that fuzzy search technology. And he wants to see any purchasing cards that are linked by transactions to specific expenses. Now this time he chooses to look at only 1 year at a time, beginning with 2006. And we get a number of results, and we are able to go through and look at the individual detail if we choose. However, visuals are much easier to understand than staring at rows and columns, so we add all of the results to our charting tool. Mr. Brown has used his purchasing card at several locations during the year. So to determine which area deserves a little bit more attention than others, the analyst utilizes another powerful tool called social network analysis. Social network analysis is not referring to Facebook and Twitter in this case. Instead, it's referring to a series of centrality measures that are based on algorithms built into the back end of the software. And this allows you to identify the relationships that exist between entities in any given network. So it is not specific to people, but it refers to any entity, so any place or thing. We can select one or all of these choices, depending on what we think will work best for our investigation, and ask the tool to calculate and do the work for us. The results are stack ranked, either in ascending or descending order, whatever we prefer. And as we select through these, it's also divided up and sorted out by entity type. One entity that received high scores was FedEx. Now, Mr. Brown does frequent FedEx, which is expected based on his job functions. However, some other interesting results are the high number of restaurant meals that the company is paying for, as well as the fact that he has several purchases at Office Max. Based on policy, office supplies are only supposed to be purchased in an emergency. And in this case, having 6 emergency in 1 year seems unreasonable. So our analyst looks more closely at these specific purchases. He sees that 2 of them were made on the same day, and that the amounts are just under the single purchase spending limit of $1,000. Also, notice the expense types that Mr. Brown claimed, in this case postage and entertainment. These seem inappropriate for an office supply store. Again, in just a matter of a few minutes, our analyst has now found evidence of purchase card abuse. Taking yet another investigative path, David remembers how many meal expenses that Mr. Brown was directly reimbursed for, as well as how many restaurants that he utilized his purchasing card at. So he chooses and decides to compare the two to ensure everything is on the up and up. Doing another simple query of his repository, he looks at 2 months' worth of expenses that are categorized as meals and entertainment. And this comes both from the expense reimbursement as well as the purchasing card sides, combined onto one chart for comparison purposes. Utilizing the timeline chart style, he not only is able to see the relationships between the different entities, but he's also able to see each expenditure and the flow of activity as they are now locked to a time bar. By simply narrowing the field and applying a filter to the information on the chart, David quickly realizes that Mr. Brown has submitted several duplicate expenses. Meals and entertainment which were paid for using his purchasing card were also submitted manually for direct reimbursement. So Mr. Brown appears to be double dipping on his expenses, having 7 of the same meal expenditures in one single day. With very little time or effort, our analyst has confirmed the original tip and has found evidence of several additional instances of waste, abuse, and even fraud. From my own personal experience, identifying anomalies and issues such as this can easily take days or even weeks to find using spreadsheets alone. Now that our analyst David has uncovered valuable intelligence so efficiently, he's able to quickly move on to the next case. In this situation, he analyzes the activity of an executive named Mary Vickers. He's particularly interested in her because although she has a purchasing card issued to her, she never uses it, but instead manually expenses everything. Just as he did with Mr. Brown, David begins with a large amount of Miss Vickers' information and expenditures. And using those same types of methods and easily pulling investigative threads, he quickly identifies that she has submitted reimbursement requests for the same day and the same expenses on 3 different reports. The accounts payable system didn't catch the duplicate payments, but fraud intelligence analysis has. As we scroll through, we see multiple expenditures that have been applied to 2 different expense reports. David has accomplished great results in a short amount of time, and he needs to make sure that the appropriate people within his organization are notified. He adds the final results of both investigations into the collaborative repository, where others, such as his legal team, can view the relevant information. Because some users don't need the full power of the fraud intelligence analysis solution, such as the charting tool that we've been using, they can access just what they need through a secure web portal. In this case, others who have the authority to log into the portal can immediately see the results of David's analysis so they can take action right away. They are able to view the final chart and its details directly in a secure web page. Conducting a proactive investigation using fraud intelligence analysis has allowed David to zero in on several instances of fraud, waste, and abuse in a very short amount of time. Investigating these types of issues by manually combing through each separate database could have taken days or even weeks in some cases. Now, David was able to condense and summarize all of the valuable intelligence he gathered into clear and concise charts. Upon completion of his analysis, as well as internal interviews, both Ms. Vickers and Mr. Brown admitted to their wrongdoing, and the charts were presented to others as appropriate to assist with successful resolution of these issues.